In this video, I want to go over some of the more popular evil versions of Sonic and rank them from the most dangerous to the least dangerous. I'm going to rank them on how powerful they are, how they actually affect the real world, and how evil they are. And the categories will be savage at the top, then vicious, scary, and bad at the very bottom. Now I'm going to start off with the savage tier, and this is going to have Shin Sonic first because he's the one that's fresh in my mind, and because I think all the characters in this tier will be pretty close to each other. Now the reason that Shin makes it to this tier is because he is one of the strongest evil versions of Sonic that also has the ability to affect people in the real world. There's no ritual that people need to summon him, and he isn't like trapped behind a video game or in the virtual world in general. He gets to walk around in broad daylight and devour people freely. Shin also has the most, if not all, the same abilities as the normal Sonic, but he also has the ability to change the size of his body, even being able to turn into a Godzilla-sized creature and still maintain his speed. And if all that wasn't bad enough, he also sacrifices people to the demon lord Malik. And with all that being said, I don't think anybody would disagree that Shin Sonic definitely deserves to be in this high tier. Next on this list is going to be a version of Sonic that you may not remember, and that is No More Innocence. And Innocence is actually a Japanese spirit that feeds off the happiness of children. The children that he feeds on the most are children who are fans of Sonic the Hedgehog. Now the good news here is that he doesn't actually eat the children, he just eats that happy feeling that they get when they're playing Sonic the Hedgehog. The bad news here though is that he also makes the children even more addicted to the video game. So basically he takes kids who are already playing this game a lot and he makes it to where the game is kind of like a drug. And if the kids don't actually play the game, it's almost as if they go through a physical type of pain. The game is no longer something that they do in their free time or just for pleasure. It becomes something that they have to do. So while Innocence may not seem as dangerous as some other form of Sonic.exe, the fact that he can more easily attack people in the real world and that he is pure evil is why he ranks so highly. Next is going to be Rewrite Sonic, and even though this guy looks kind of derpy, his backstory is surprisingly dark. Now, oddly enough, Rewrite is like a demonic egomaniac that was created with the purpose of being a digital version of God. And I know that sounds crazy, so I'll go ahead and start from the beginning so it makes sense. Basically, back in the 90s, there was this evil priest that decided to create a computer program that would allow desperate people to speak with God. Obviously, the computer program was fake and only used to exploit people out of their money. And even though the church knew this, it still sold tons of copies of this program. And while all was well for a little bit, eventually people started dying. Or more accurately, the people who brought this program suddenly decided to take their own life. And while an investigation was launched, it was hard for the police to actually find any evidence. The priest, however, wanted to get ahead of the situation, so he booted up the program on his own computer to see if he could figure out what was going on. And when he tried to communicate with the program, he was surprised to see that it actually responded. And to be clear, this is a big deal because the whole thing was supposed to be a scam, so there's not supposed to be any real response. Now the priest asked the program what it was, and the only response that it gave him was, "I am God." The priest ended up dying because his house ended up burning down, and while there is no proof, I think it's safe to assume that Rewrite made him do it. And as goofy as it sounds to rank him so highly, I think the fact that he is another character that is super evil, but also really affects people in the real world fairly easily, has to have him ranked high. Next in this tier is going to be Allfather, and even though he's like a more recent EXE, or at least he got popular recently, his abilities and his backstory make him rank very high. This character basically gets more powerful the more people actually know of his existence. So in a way, he's very similar to like the old school gods and demigods who basically got power if people actually worship them. But his ability is even better because he gets power if people worship him, fear him, adore him, or if people just know him in general. Which, as I'm sure some of you can imagine, would make him a very hard character to deal with because his power would scale very quickly. And it seems that the Allfather knows this because his main goal is basically just to spread his name as far as he possibly can. And considering that we live in the era of social media, if this guy was really tech savvy, it would be very easy to get out in front of millions of people. And while it's hard to tell in the mod, if you actually read his backstory, his whole goal is basically to be known, but also to take the souls of the people who know him. And not just the main body, but each of his clones can also take their victims' souls. And this is why I rank him so high on this list. And I think the character that's going to end off this tier is going to be Weare. Now, the first thing to understand is that Weare is not a person, but rather a virus that can infect people and take over their bodies. The worst part is that the virus doesn't allow the host to stay alive in any way, but instead slowly devours them from the inside until they are nothing more than an empty husk. Very similar to the cordyceps virus if you played the Last of Us games or watched the TV show. The fact that he is a real-life virus that can affect a person and basically hollow out their body makes him one of the more vicious versions of Sonic out there. And speaking of vicious, we're going to go ahead and move to the vicious category, and I think I have to start this off with Fleetway Super Sonic. And I know that in terms of strength, this version of Sonic is obviously top tier, but I place him in the vicious category because he's not pure evil. If you ever actually read his comic, for a while he even lived a normal life in the city with this black cat that could like do magic. It seems that as long as he stayed away from the Chaos Crystals, he could basically live as like a regular member of society. The reason that he still ranks so high though is because eventually he does need to go back and kind of consume that chaos energy, meaning that even if he can be chill for a while, eventually he's going to go on a rampage again. And when he does, he is so strong that he can take on Sonic and his whole crew. So I definitely think he deserves his spot. Next, I think we're gonna have to go with Lord X. Now, contrary to popular belief, Lord X and Sonicexe are not technically the same character. From what we know about Lord X thus far, he is actually an extraterrestrial being originating from the space between universes, or aka the Void. And even though technically Lord X can take on any form that he wants, he has this weird fascination with Sonic the Hedgehog, which is why he looks like a monstrous version of Sonic. My theory is that this has a lot to do with Lord X's personality. He's very methodical, very intelligent, and I think he believes that if he takes on the persona of a hero, people will be more likely to trust him. And this ties in with that twisted personality that he has. He's like if you gave a very smart but demented child endless power. And in turn, he sees humans and other creatures as toys. And I mean this in a literal sense. Lord X likes to play games with his victims that are obviously rigged against them. And if they lose, Lord X will basically devour their soul and their actual bodies. I always say that Lord X is one of the scariest versions of Sonic.exe because he basically will erase you from existence, literally. The only reason I didn't put him in the savage category is because he's one of those characters that is basically trapped behind a video game disc, meaning that if a person doesn't actually play the game that he's trapped in, you won't actually be able to get trapped or sucked into Lord X's world. So that kind of brings him down one tier in my opinion. And the last character I'm going to put in this tier is going to be Sonic.exe. And some of you may not know this one because he isn't as popular as some of the other characters on this list, but he's basically like another version of Fatal Error. And what I mean by this is that he is a corrupt computer virus that will steal your information and then sell it to people on the dark web. Now, while that definitely isn't as terrible as some of the other people on this list, the dark web is a very real place and it is actually very, very scary. It isn't uncommon to hear about people being kidnapped and all type of crazy stuff happening on the dark web. And I don't know if a lot of you watched Corey Kenshin's Spooky Scary Sunday back when he was still posting, but a lot of those videos that he was reacting to actually dealt with the dark web stuff, and it was super dark. Go check some of them out if you don't believe me. Next up, we're going to go ahead and move over to the scary tier, and I think we need to kick it off with Hog and Scorch here. I've always kind of liked this character because I thought he was pretty unique, at least like in the Sonic universe, and because it's basically two different characters in one body. Hog seems to be more of a good character that kind of plays the hero role with his friends, while Scorch is like this evil version of Sonic that lives inside of him and can be released like the Hulk or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde type situation. And the reason that he's called Scorch is because he can burn hot enough to roast anybody who he touches. I'm not going to post these guys too much higher than this because I know that their backstory has changed since I actually read the original, but I still think that we can't place them too high because at least Hog attempts to keep Scorch in check. But when he does transform, I don't think anybody will argue that he isn't a scary figure to have to fight. Now, next in the scary tier, and this one may be a little controversial for you guys, but I think I'm going to go ahead and put Sonic.exe here. I know when you think of EXE characters or evil Sonic forms, Sonic.exe probably is at the top of your list, but when you think about his actual influence outside of the video game world, it's very slim. Sonic.exe can terrorize all these little characters inside the video game, but outside of that, he doesn't really have any power, right? When you think about characters like Shin Sonic, when you think about Lord X, or even Weare, these are characters that are able to function in the real world and not just in the virtual world. So I think that Sonic.exe is definitely a character worth being in the mid tier because he is definitely evil and he is powerful. It's just that his power is very limited, right? The next character I'm going to put in the scary tier is going to be Needlemouse, and I know a lot of people may not consider this a evil version of Sonic, especially because Needlemouse is female, but when you look at her actual wiki, it does say Needlemouse Sonic, so I'm going to go ahead and throw her in here. Now, the reason that I just put her in the scary tier is because I'm actually on her side, even though she does take out a few people. If you remember in her backstory, basically she and some of her friends got drunk one night and her friends ended up beating her so badly that she basically would have needed to go to the hospital and get like surgery, right? Get real help. But instead of doing that, they buried her like in a ditch. And then later on, the Sega Corporation actually came and built a base like over her grave. And since Needlemouse, aka Sarah, never really got her vengeance, she basically became a angry spirit and she ended up like putting her soul into some of the video games. And she basically used like these video games being distributed to find the friends that had buried her and taking them out one by one. And while I will never say that murder is a good thing, I will say if somebody does what they did to her, I kind of feel like I'm on her side. And considering that she didn't hurt anybody else, I don't think I can put her much higher than scary. Next up, we have a character named Cyclops Sonic, and I think this guy probably should be a little bit higher on this list because his abilities and what he actually did were pretty impressive. Kind of like Lord X, he's basically like a creature of the void, and when he finally did come to Sonic's world, he has the ability to where any person that looks upon him kind of becomes like his own personal slave. And if that's not bad enough, he also has the power to mind control people, and he can also shapeshift, basically taking the form of anybody that he wants. And anybody that he takes under his control, he can also like siphon their soul, and then he can convert that into power for himself. The only reason I feel weird about placing this guy higher is because in his mod, we actually got to see him kind of go against Fatal Error Sonic, and I don't think Fatal Error is one of the more powerful Sonics to be put like in the world in general. And at the end of the mod, it's kind of implied that Fatal Error wins their battle. So I do feel a little bit conflicted about this guy because he obviously does have a lot of power and he's obviously evil, but there's people who I would consider to be fairly weak, at least in this universe, that are able to take him out. I truly think somebody like Eggman would probably figure out how to do away with this character if given the time to do so. Now, I think next up, since we just spoke about Fatal Error, this is a perfect place to put him. And Fatal Error is kind of weird because he reminds me a lot of the Sonic.exe that we spoke about earlier, but it doesn't have the ability to actually reach out to like real people or to the dark web. But it's basically just limited to the Sonic games, or aka the Sonic virtual universe. So kind of like sonic.exe, it gives those characters hell, but it doesn't really affect anybody outside of that game world. But I think obviously it deserves to at least be in the scary tier because it was able to go toe to toe with Cyclops, which is a big deal within itself. But I can't imagine putting Fatal Error any higher than where it is right now. Now, I know that I said the last category is going to be bad, but I think I'm just going to change it to okay or fine because these characters aren't really bad. And I think the first character I'm going to put up here to kind of get the point across is Sunky. While he is a popular EXE, he definitely isn't evil. When you look into his backstory, he doesn't actually want to do anybody harm. All he really wants to do is party and feed people milk and cereal. So I think I would have a hard time placing this guy in any tier outside of this good tier. Now, the next character that we're going to put in this category is going to be Majin Sonic. And while I think he's a little more, I don't know, scary than Sunky, he's not really bad enough to put any higher than where he is. The reason I say this is because when you look at his actual wiki, all he wants to do is have fun with the people around. He's also described as being kind and like polite to the people that he's battling. The only time that he will do harm to a person is like, for instance, if Boyfriend loses a rap battle to him, he'll use his clones to basically turn Boyfriend into a clone, but only so that they can continue to battle and like have fun. So while I can't understand that this guy is probably a little more evil than Sunky, I still can't really put him in any of these higher tiers because he just isn't scary and he definitely isn't vicious or savage. Next, we have a character that definitely deserves to be in this tier, and that's going to be Kurur Sonic. And while I know that Kurur Sonic's backstory has changed a lot, because I know that this character has been passed around from different creators and whatnot, but I think the thing that has stayed true through most of it is that Kurur was always kind of meant to be more of like a victim than a person who was actually causing issues. I remember in the original story that Kurur Sonic and Knuckles were out like running, and then there's a landslide, and while Sonic actually gets away with just like some messed up legs, Knuckles actually ends up passing away. And basically all of Kurur's friends end up betraying them. The only person that actually comes to their aid is Dr. Eggman. But even with all this drama and everything that Kurtz went through, they were still described as being like a kind-hearted person that didn't really want to do harm to anybody and always tried to keep a smile, even when like the darkest times were around them. So I definitely think that this is a character that deserves to be in this good tier or the fine tier. Sanic is another character that I'm going to put in this tier, and I think Sanic was always kind of meant to be a joke. I know a lot of y'all probably remember seeing Sanic pop up like in the Sonic the Hedgehog movie. Sonic has had like a goofy game been built around it, and even like the background and most of the F&F mods are just meant to be like memes or from Gmods or something like that. And I think the derpiness of the design kind of gives away that this character is never meant to be like a villain or to be taken too seriously. It's just meant to give people a good laugh. And I do want to throw one honorable mention in here. This character isn't popular enough to where I thought he really deserved to be in this video, but Void Sonic does have a really interesting backstory, and he kind of falls into like the anti-hero category, so he doesn't really have a place on this tier list where he falls neatly. But he's definitely an interesting character, and he has some interesting abilities, but I think he's more of a good guy, even though, you know, he's done some terrible things. But with that being said, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out this video on the screen here. Subscribe today to become a member of the Oris Force, and we'll see you tomorrow with another one. Peace, peace.